Welcome back to the Hungry Theologian podcast. Hopefully, you can tell that I got a new microphone. The sound should be significantly better than my last podcast episode. We're continuing to go through the values that are foundational to Hungry Theologian. So, last week I talked about living at a deliberate pace. And today I want to talk about long term thinking. We live in a time that highly values quick results, instant gratification, and many people will give up on a diet or an exercise plan if they don't see the results they want coming quickly enough. Or think about spiritual disciplines. I'm sure you've heard someone say something like this, or maybe you've said it yourself. I tried doing that Bible reading plan or this prayer practice, and it just didn't really do much for me. And I want to say, how long did you try it for? You're disappointed when you look at the results after a few days or maybe a few weeks. But what if you practice that spiritual discipline every day for a year or every day for 5 years? I'm sure the results of this would be a little bit different. But most of us aren't very good at thinking on that sort of a time scale. If we're not seeing positive change in the short term, it doesn't seem like it's worth the investment. But to stick with this language of investment, any seasoned investor will tell you that long-term gains radically outpace short-term gains. The potential for long-term gains radically outpaces anything you'll see in the short term. If you want to get rich quick, investing isn't for you, but wise investing can help you build wealth long-term. So long-term thinking is incredibly important. The construction of medieval cathedrals, I think, is another example of where long-term thinking is so evident. The great cathedrals in Europe not only continue to be spaces for worship, but they're also tourist destinations. Almost everyone who visits places in Europe where these great cathedrals are still standing will go visit them, whether or not they care about the religious function of the cathedrals. And the reason is because these are amazing examples of the human capacity to produce beauty. These cathedrals are some of the best examples of architecture that we have. And people visit these cathedrals regardless of their religious beliefs because there's something special about these structures. But these great cathedrals often took decades to construct, and some of them even took centuries to construct when the funding wasn't all in place. That means these cathedrals were sometimes multi-generational projects, and the people who began the work didn't get to see it completed. If you're willing to think long term, the results can be so much more than when we get stuck in short term thinking. But long term thinking is difficult, and I don't think this is unique to our time period that we struggle with long term thinking. Think about the story of Abraham. God promised him many descendants, but he had trouble trusting God's promise when it didn't come to pass. So he had a child with his wife's servant Hagar instead. That's where Ishmael came from. Long-term thinking requires us to trust God with a future that isn't in our control. And long-term thinking might mean that the inefficient way is actually the right way. If I want to get my toddler's teeth brushed, then the fastest way is for me to just do it myself. I know how to brush her teeth quickly. I can get in there, get it all done. But if I want her to learn how to brush her teeth, she needs to do it herself, even if it takes longer and prolongs the morning and evening routines a little bit. If I'm thinking long term that I want her to know how to brush her teeth, then the inefficient way of letting her do it herself is the better way. Efficiency is really important when you're thinking short term. You want to get the results in the quickest way possible using the least amount of resources. But when you extend the time horizon outwards, the efficiency calculation becomes a little less significant. And this is why I advocate for cooking extravagant meals. There are goods that accrue from feasting with family and friends that are well worth the cost of the time and money that it takes to make great food. The short-term good of tasting the food is only a small piece of all that happens during a feast. Feasting builds and deepens relationships. It becomes a vehicle through which the joys and sorrows of life are shared. Feasting isn't efficient, but it's certainly good. And with each of these values, I want to give you a practice to help you make this value more tangible in your life. So the practice to help you grow in long-term thinking is to sketch out what life might look like for you in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. This isn't a plan you're going to hold yourself to. You might think of it as a set of goals, or you might just be making some educated guesses about where things might be headed. But the point of this exercise is to get you thinking about these time horizons, these longer time horizons of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and to think about them in regard to various aspects of your life: work, family, school, church, friendships, hobbies, where you live, skills that you want to develop. And again, I'm not saying you need to plan out the next 20 years of your life. At that time horizon of 20 years from now, things are going to be pretty rough. But forcing yourself to think long term might help you see things a little bit differently. Maybe you have a certain vision for family life that your current lifestyle isn't moving you towards. Maybe you want to start a new hobby now so that down the road you've built up the years of experience that make it even more enjoyable and fruitful. And the hope is that practicing long-term thinking, trying to sketch out your life in 5, 10, 20 years from now, even if that's a little difficult to do, will bring some clarity to your present decision making. If you're not regularly engaging these longer time horizons, then you might be missing some of the ways that your values aren't shaping your life currently, aren't shaping your present decision making. If you're too stuck in short-term thinking, immediate results, instant gratification, you need to be able to break out of that and to see how you're living your values in a way that's going to get you where you want to be long term, in a way that's going to build the kind of life that you dream of having in the long term. This podcast will most likely be off next week for Christmas, but I have an episode coming in response to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, where I'll be talking to a couple friends who were members of Mars Hill Church in Seattle at its peak. So stay tuned for that discussion. I'm really looking forward to it and responding to the podcast a little bit more generally and some of the issues that I think this raises for us to consider in the contemporary church. So Merry Christmas and God bless.